The Fall of Scotland, a Kingdom in Chains. The tragedy that befell Scotland began not with a clash of swords, but with a misstep in the dark. On a stormy night in March 1286, King Alexander III insisted on riding through treacherous conditions to reach his young queen at Kinghorn. His horse stumbled along the cliffside path, and by sunrise, Scotland's most capable king in generations lay dead at the base of a rocky precipice. The kingdom's fate now rested on the delicate shoulders of his only living heir, a 3-year-old girl in faraway Norway who would become known to history as the Maid of Norway. Edward Warrant of England, the man they called Hammer of the Scots, though he had yet to earn that fearsome title, saw his opportunity. A seasoned manipulator who had already subjugated Wales, Edward positioned himself as arbiter in the succession crisis that followed the Maid's untimely death at sea. The competing claims of 13 Scottish nobles, the competitors, played perfectly into his hands. Each claimant, desperate for his support, was willing to acknowledge him as Overlord of Scotland. Among them, John Balliol emerged victorious, but his crown came with golden chains. Edward's demands on his puppet king grew increasingly humiliating. Balliol was forced to send Scottish troops to support English campaigns in France. Scottish nobles were compelled to answer for their actions in English courts. When Balliol finally attempted resistance in 1296, Edward's response was swift and brutal. At Dunbar, Scottish forces were crushed. Balliol was stripped of his royal regalia in a ceremony designed to maximize his shame. His tabard was torn off, earning him the nickname Tomb Tabard, empty coat. The Stone of Destiny, Scotland's ancient coronation stone, was carried south to Westminster. Edward's officers moved north, installing themselves in Scotland's castles and strongholds, implementing a harsh regime of taxation and military occupation. This was the Scotland into which William Wallace emerged, a land where Scottish nobles were forced to sign the ragman rolls, swearing fealty to Edward, where English sheriffs dispensed English law, and where resistance seemed not just futile, but unthinkable. Yet in this atmosphere of submission and despair, a handful of Scots began to imagine the unimaginable. Among them was a young man from Elderslie, whose name would become synonymous with resistance against overwhelming odds. William Wallace, the making of a revolutionary. History has a way of obscuring its greatest figures in shadow until the moment they step into the light. So it was with William Wallace. Born into the minor nobility of Elderslie, Renfrewshire, around 1270, he grew up in a household that straddled two worlds: the martial traditions of his father's family and the literary education provided by his uncle, a priest at Dunipace. In his uncle's library, young William pored over copies of classical military texts, stories of Vegetius and Julius Caesar that would later influence his innovative battle tactics. But it was in the forests and hills around his home where he learned the practical skills of survival that would prove invaluable in the years to come. The spark that transformed Wallace from an educated young nobleman into a resistance leader came in May 1297, though accounts differ on the exact catalyst. One version tells of a personal tragedy in Lanark, where English soldiers harassed Wallace and his wife Marion Braidfute. The confrontation ended in bloodshed, with Marion dead and Wallace's first act of revenge, the killing of William Heselrigg, the English sheriff. Whether this account is precise in its details, it captures a fundamental truth. Wallace's rebellion began not with grand political ambitions, but with a visceral response to English brutality. Wallace's initial campaigns demonstrated the tactical genius that would later stun the English at Stirling Bridge. Operating from the wild forests of Selkirk, he pioneered a form of guerrilla warfare perfectly suited to Scotland's challenging terrain. His first major victory came at Lanark, where his men used the narrow streets to trap and eliminate the English garrison. The success drew others to his cause, not just peasants and minor nobles, but skilled warriors disillusioned with their compromised leadership. Each raid was carefully planned, each retreat meticulously executed. English supply lines were cut, isolated garrisons overwhelmed, and collaborators targeted with brutal efficiency. Word of Wallace's successes spread north, where another rebellion was taking shape under Andrew de Moray, a young nobleman who had escaped English imprisonment. While Moray organized resistance in the north, Wallace's influence grew in the south. English records from the summer of 1297 reveal increasing panic among their commanders, reports of ambushes, disappeared patrols, and growing unrest. Wallace's name appears in these documents with increasing frequency, transforming from an unknown outlaw into a figure of genuine concern for the English administration. What set Wallace apart was not just his military acumen, but his ability to inspire. Unlike the noble-led rebellions that preceded him, Wallace's movement cut across social boundaries. His own status, a minor noble leading common men, helped bridge the gap between classes. He demanded loyalty not to himself, but to the concept of an independent Scotland, a radical notion in an age dominated by personal fealties. This ideological dimension would prove crucial in transforming scattered acts of resistance into a national uprising. By late summer of 1297, Wallace had evolved from a local guerrilla leader into a serious military threat. His forces had grown from a small band into an army capable of challenging English power in the field. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of English control in Scotland. As his men gathered near Stirling, Wallace prepared to match his unconventional tactics against the might of English heavy cavalry. The gamble would either establish him as a serious military commander or end his rebellion before it could truly begin. The Gathering Storm, Scotland's fight for freedom. Summer 1297 brought an oppressive heat to Scotland, but it wasn't just the weather that made English commanders uneasy. From their fortified positions, they watched as the countryside slipped from their control. The north had erupted under Andrew de Moray, a brilliant young tactician who had escaped English imprisonment in Northumberland and returned to his homeland with revenge in his heart. His success at Inverness had inspired others. Within months, he had cleared much of northern Scotland of English garrisons through a series of lightning raids and strategic sieges. John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey and Edward Bwang's appointed Guardian of Scotland, faced a deteriorating situation. His reports to London grew increasingly urgent. The rebellion had spread beyond mere bandits in the hills. Now armed columns moved openly through the countryside. Surrey's lieutenants brought alarming news. Tax collectors murdered, English officials driven from their posts, Scottish lords quietly withdrawing their support. Most worrying were the reports about Wallace. The outlaw was showing disturbing tactical sophistication, choosing his targets with strategic precision that suggested a broader plan. The English response was hampered by Edward Warren's absence. The king was in Flanders, pursuing his continental ambitions. Surrey, elderly and cautious, hesitated to commit his forces without royal guidance. His indecision proved costly. By late August, Wallace and Moray had made contact, coordinating their efforts despite their different backgrounds. Moray, the noble heir to a northern estate, and Wallace, the southern guerrilla leader, found common cause in their vision of Scottish independence. Their combined forces began systematically isolating English strongholds, cutting supply lines and communications. Stirling Castle stood as the key to central Scotland, controlling the main route between north and south. The narrow bridge nearby was one of the few places armies could cross the River Forth. As August turned to September, both sides recognized its critical importance. Surrey finally mobilized his army northward, gathering the flower of English chivalry heavily armored cavalry that had proved devastating on other battlefields. His force included Hugh de Cressingham, Edward's treasurer for Scotland, an arrogant man whose fiscal brutality had earned him the hatred of both Scottish nobles and commoners. Wallace and Moray chose their ground carefully. The Abbey Craig, a steep hill overlooking the bridge crossing, offered a perfect vantage point. From here, they could observe every movement of Surrey's army, while keeping their own forces concealed in the surrounding woodlands. More importantly, the geography created a natural bottleneck. The wooden bridge, barely wide enough for two horsemen to ride abreast, would force the English to cross in a thin column, negating their numerical superiority and the advantage of their heavy cavalry. As Surrey's army arrived at Stirling on September 10th, the air was thick with tension. English scouts reported the Scottish position, but Surrey's commanders fatally misread the situation. They saw only a rabble of spearmen led by upstart rebels, not the disciplined force Wallace and Moray had forged. That night, as campfires dotted both sides of the river, Wallace gathered his commanders. The plan he outlined was audacious in its simplicity, relying on English overconfidence and the disciplined patience of his men. By dawn, the stage would be set for one of history's most decisive military ambushes. The eve of battle, Stirling Bridge, 1297. Dawn on September 11th, 1297, revealed an imposing sight. The English army arrayed in full martial splendor south of the Forth. Their camp sprawled across the riverside meadows, a sea of colorful pavilions and banners that masked the chaos of their command. Surrey, plagued by gout, had slept poorly. His treasurer, Cressingham, pushed aggressively for an immediate attack, dismissing the elderly earl's concerns about the crossing. The bridge, weathered and worn, creaked ominously under the weight of supply wagons. Its wooden planks, barely wide enough for two mounted knights to cross abreast, would become the focal point of everything that followed. A Scottish knight in Surrey's service, Sir Richard Lundy, offered crucial advice that would go fatefully unheeded. He knew of a nearby ford where 60 horsemen could cross simultaneously, allowing the English to outflank Wallace's position. But Cressingham, eager to end the campaign and return to his ledgers, scorned the suggestion. "Why waste time with such expenses?" he demanded. "Let us cross and end this." His words, recorded by chroniclers, would prove darkly prophetic, though not in the way he intended. High above on Abbey Craig, Wallace and Moray watched the English preparations through the morning mist. Their own forces, approximately 2,000 spearmen and a small contingent of light cavalry, remained concealed in the dense woods behind the hill. The position had been chosen with a surgeon's precision. The bridge's northern end opened onto a narrow loop of land hemmed in by the river's bend. This natural trap would nullify English cavalry charges, transforming their greatest strength into a fatal vulnerability. Wallace had positioned his Schiltron's disciplined formations of spearmen just out of sight, ready to respond the moment his signal was given. As evening approached, Surrey made one final attempt at negotiation, perhaps sensing the trap that lay before him. He dispatched Dominican friars to offer terms. Wallace's reported response became legendary. "We come not here to make peace, but to do battle to defend ourselves and liberate our kingdom. Let them come on, and we shall prove this in their very beards." The words, whether precisely accurate, captured the spirit of the moment, a declaration of Scottish determination that would echo through centuries. That night, both armies prepared for battle in starkly different ways. In the English camp, knights attended mass and feasted, confident in their superior numbers and equipment. Their horses were groomed, armor polished, and weapons sharpened. Surrey's commanders debated the order of crossing, each noble vying for the honor of leading the vanguard. None seemed to consider that this competition for glory might play directly into their enemies' hands. In the Scottish camp, Wallace gathered his commanders for final instructions. Each unit received precise orders about their positioning and timing. Signaling systems were established, using horns whose sound would carry across the battlefield. The plan relied entirely on discipline. Any premature movement would alert the English to the trap. As his men bedded down for the night, Wallace reportedly walked among them, reinforcing the importance of waiting for his signal, no matter how tempting it might be to strike early. The autumn night settled over both armies, broken only by the sound of the river and the distant calls of night birds. In a matter of hours, this tranquil scene would transform into one of the most decisive battlefields in Scottish history. The English, despite their martial experience, had critically underestimated both their opponent and the battlefield itself. As the last light faded, Wallace stood at the edge of Abbey Craig, watching torches flicker in the English camp. Tomorrow would determine whether his careful planning would result in catastrophic defeat or historic victory. The Battle of Stirling Bridge, a triumph of strategy and determination. Morning fog clung to the River Forth on September 11th as the English vanguard assembled at the bridge's southern end. The air was crisp, heavy with autumn dew and anticipation. Surrey, still in his tent nursing his gout, had delegated command to Cressingham, whose impatience would prove fatal. Shortly after dawn, the English began their crossing. First the Welsh infantry, followed by heavily armoured cavalry. The wooden bridge groaned under the weight of steel and horseflesh. From Abbey Craig, Wallace watched the crossing begin. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the English would retreat. Too late, and too many would cross. He waited until approximately 5,000 English troops had made the crossing, nearly a third of their army. The bridge was packed with soldiers, and the northern end had become congested with cavalry struggling to form up on the boggy ground. Now the trap would snap shut with devastating efficiency. Wallace's signal horn shattered the morning quiet. In an instant, the hidden Scottish Schiltrons emerged from the woodlands, their forest of spears gleaming in the morning light. A select unit of spearmen charged forward to secure the bridge's northern end, cutting off any possibility of retreat. The English cavalry, hemmed in by the river's loop and their own continuing reinforcements, found themselves unable to mount an effective charge. Their greatest advantage, heavy cavalry, had become a liability in the confined space. Panic erupted among the English troops north of the river. Some tried to retreat across the bridge, colliding with those still crossing. Others attempted to fight their way through to firmer ground, only to meet the disciplined walls of Scottish spears. Cressingham, resplendent in his expensive armour, led a desperate charge to break through the Scottish lines. He fell in the attempt, his death sending shockwaves through the English ranks. According to contemporary accounts, the Scots would later strip his body and cut his skin into strips for souvenirs, a grim testament to how deeply he was hated. The decisive moment came when the bridge itself, stressed beyond its capacity by the weight of armoured men and horses, began to fail. With a thunderous crack, a section collapsed, plunging scores of English soldiers into the river. The sight of their comrades drowning in heavy armour spread terror through the remaining English forces. Those north of the river faced a horrific choice: death by drowning, death by spear, or surrender. Surrey, watching helplessly from the southern bank, ordered a retreat to prevent further losses. He had waited too long. There was no way to help those trapped on the north bank. The English army withdrew toward Berwick, leaving behind thousands of dead, wounded, and captured. Among the dead were some of England's finest knights and commanders, their elaborate armour proving worse than useless in the churning waters of the Forth. The Scottish pursuit was methodical and deadly. Light cavalry harried the retreating English, while Wallace's infantry secured prisoners of value for ransom. By midday, the battle had transformed into a rout. Surrey fled south, his reputation in tatters, while Wallace and Moray had achieved what many thought impossible: a decisive victory over the premier army in Christendom. As evening fell, the Scots surveyed their triumph. The river had turned red with blood, its waters choked with bodies and debris. The bridge, symbol of English control, lay broken. Most importantly, the myth of English invincibility had been shattered. A force of commoners and minor nobles, led by a brilliant tactician, had destroyed a professional army through superior strategy and discipline. The victory would resonate through Scottish history, proving that determination and tactical brilliance could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The aftermath and legacy of Stirling Bridge. News of Stirling Bridge spread through Scotland like wildfire, transforming Wallace overnight from a guerrilla leader into a national hero. Within weeks, most English garrisons north of the Forth had surrendered or fled. The victory's immediate impact was staggering. Scotland, for the first time since Edward VI's invasion, stood effectively free. Wallace and Moray were appointed guardians of Scotland, ruling in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. But triumph came with a bitter price. Moray, wounded during the battle, succumbed to his injuries a few months later. His death deprived Scotland of one of its finest military minds and left Wallace to shoulder the burden of leadership alone. The Scottish victory revolutionized medieval warfare. Wallace had demonstrated that well-disciplined infantry, properly positioned, could defeat heavy cavalry, the dominant military force of the age. His tactical innovation at Stirling Bridge would influence military thinking for generations. European commanders studied the battle, learning that terrain and timing could nullify traditional advantages of aristocratic armies. The Schiltron formation, perfected by Wallace and Moray, would become a standard Scottish military tactic, proving its worth again at Bannockburn years later. In London, news of the defeat sent Edward I into a rage. The king, returning from his campaign in Flanders, immediately ordered a massive mobilization. His response would come the following year at Falkirk, where overwhelming numbers and Welsh longbowmen would finally defeat Wallace's army. Yet even this couldn't erase the psychological impact of Stirling Bridge. The battle had shattered the aura of invincibility surrounding English arms and inspired resistance movements for centuries to come. Archaeological discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of the battle. Recent excavations near the battle site have unearthed arrowheads, broken weapons, and personal effects that paint a vivid picture of the conflict. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed evidence of mass graves, confirming contemporary accounts of the battle's brutality. Most intriguingly, studies of the riverbed have uncovered remnants of the original bridge, allowing historians to precisely map the battlefield and validate Wallace's tactical genius. The battle's legacy extends far beyond military history. Stirling Bridge became a symbol of Scottish identity and resistance against overwhelming odds. Its impact on Scottish culture and nationalism can be traced through centuries of art, literature, and popular memory. While later depictions, particularly in film and fiction, often play loose with historical accuracy, the core truth remains: a brilliant tactician, leading a force of commoners and minor nobles, had succeeded where armies of Scottish nobility had failed. Modern Stirling still bears witness to these events. The Wallace Monument, rising from Abbey Craig where Wallace surveyed the battlefield, stands as a testament to the battle's enduring significance. The current bridge, though not the original wooden structure, marks a site where history pivoted. Here, on a misty September morning, William Wallace proved that determination, tactical brilliance, and careful planning could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds, a lesson that resonates as powerfully today as it did in 1297. The echo of Stirling Bridge, Wallace's legacy and lessons. Wallace's personal triumph at Stirling Bridge would prove tragically brief. By 1305, betrayed by Scottish nobles and captured near Glasgow, he faced the full vengeance of a humiliated English crown. His execution in London was deliberately spectacular, drawn, hanged, and quartered, his head placed on London Bridge, his limbs displayed in Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Aberdeen. Edward I intended the display to serve as a warning. Instead, it transformed Wallace into something more dangerous than a living rebel, a martyr whose death would inspire generations of Scots to continue the fight for independence. Yet the tactical lessons of Stirling Bridge outlived both Wallace and Edward. When Robert the Bruce planned his victory at Bannockburn in 1314, he drew directly from Wallace's playbook, choosing his ground carefully, using terrain to neutralize English cavalry, and deploying disciplined schiltrons of spearmen. The Bruce's victory, which finally secured Scottish independence, was built on the foundation Wallace had laid. Through the centuries, military commanders from the Low Countries to the Americas would study Stirling Bridge as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. The battle site itself has yielded new secrets with each generation. In 2011, archaeologists uncovered evidence of the bridge's original foundations, revealing it stood slightly upstream from its modern counterpart. Soil samples have confirmed the massive scale of the fighting, with high concentrations of organic material marking mass graves. These discoveries have allowed historians to reconstruct the battle with unprecedented precision, validating contemporary accounts of Wallace's tactical genius. Perhaps most remarkably, Stirling Bridge's influence extends into modern military thinking. The principles Wallace employed, using terrain to neutralize an enemy's advantages, the importance of discipline over numbers, and the devastating effectiveness of a well-planned ambush, remain fundamental to military strategy. His victory demonstrates that superiority in technology and resources can be overcome by innovative tactics and precise timing, a lesson studied by resistance movements and military academies alike. Today, standing on Abbey Craig in the shadow of the Wallace Monument, visitors can still survey the battlefield much as Wallace did that September morning. The river's bend remains unchanged. The terrain still shows why this was the perfect spot for such an ambush. But the site offers more than military lessons. It stands as a testament to the power of determination against overwhelming odds. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge reminds us that history's course can turn on the brilliance of a single plan, the courage of ordinary people, and the willingness to seize the perfect moment. In the end, Wallace's greatest legacy may be this: he proved that the impossible was merely difficult, that conventional wisdom could be upended by unconventional thinking, and that freedom, once imagined, could never be fully suppressed. The echo of Stirling Bridge continues to resonate, not just in Scotland, but wherever people dare to challenge seemingly invincible powers. In this way, Wallace's victory transcends its medieval context, speaking across centuries to inspire new generations with its timeless message of courage, innovation, and the power of unwavering determination.